Colonial period. Colonial history of the United States. The colonial history of the United States covers the period of European colonization of North America from the late 15th century until the unifying of the 13 British colonies and creation of the United States in 1776 during the Revolutionary War. In the late 16th century, England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic launched major colonization expeditions in North America. The death rate was very high among early immigrants, and some early attempts disappeared altogether, such as the English lost colony of Roanoke. Nevertheless, successful colonies were established within several decades. European settlers came from a variety of social and religious groups, including adventurers, farmers, indentured servants, tradesmen, and a very few from the aristocracy. Settlers included the Dutch of New Netherland, the Swedes and Finns of New Sweden, the English Quakers of the province of Pennsylvania, the English Puritans of New England, the Virginian Cavaliers, the English Catholics and Protestant nonconformists of the province of Maryland, the worthy poor of the province of Georgia, the Germans who settled the mid-Atlantic colonies, and the Ulster Scots of the Appalachian Mountains. These groups all became part of the United States when it gained its independence in 1776. Russian America and parts of New France and New Spain were also incorporated into the United States at later times. The diverse colonists from these various regions built colonies of distinctive social, religious, political, and economic style. Over time, non-British colonies east of the Mississippi River were taken over and most of the inhabitants were assimilated. In Nova Scotia, however, the British expelled the French Catholic Acadians, and many relocated to Louisiana. The two chief armed rebellions were short-lived failures in Virginia in 1676 and in New York in 1689-1691. Some of the colonies developed legalized systems of slavery centered largely around the Atlantic slave trade. Wars were recurrent between the French and the British during the French and Indian Wars. By 1760, France was defeated and its colonies were seized by Britain. On the eastern seaboard, the four distinct English regions were New England, the Middle Colonies, the Chesapeake Bay Colonies, Upper South, and the Southern Colonies, Lower South. Some historians add a fifth region of the frontier, which was never separately organized. The colonization of the United States resulted in a large decline of the indigenous population, primarily because of newly introduced diseases. A significant percentage of the American Indian tribes living in the eastern region had been ravaged by disease before 1620, possibly introduced to them decades before by explorers and sailors. Former colonies and territories in Canada. A number of states and polities formally claimed colonies and territories in Canada prior to the evolution of the current provinces and territories under the federal system. North America prior to colonization was occupied by a variety of indigenous groups consisting of band societies typical of the sparsely populated North, to loose confederacies made up of numerous hunting bands from a variety of ethnic groups, Plains region, to more structured confederacies of sedentary farming villages, Great Lakes region, to stratified hereditary structures centered on a fishing economy, Plateau and Pacific Coast regions. The colonization of Canada by Europeans began in the 10th century, when Norsemen explored and ultimately unsuccessfully attempted to settle areas of the northeastern fringes of North America. Early permanent European settlements in what is now Canada included the late 16th and 17th century French colonies of Acadia and Canada, New France, the English colonies of Newfoundland, Ireland, and Rupert's Land, the Scottish colonies of Nova Scotia and Port Royal. France lost nearly all of its colonies in North America in 1763 after the 7 Years' War to the British Empire. Britain's imperial government over a century later ceded the land to Canadian control in 1867 after Confederation. Since then, Canada's external borders have changed several times and had grown from 4 initial provinces to 10 provinces and 3 territories by 1999. Spanish colonization of the Americas. The Spanish colonization of the Americas began in 1493 on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, after the initial 1492 voyage of Genoese mariner Christopher Columbus under license from Queen Isabella I of Castile. These overseas territories of the Spanish Empire were under the jurisdiction of the Crown of Castile until the last territory was lost in 1898. Spaniards saw the dense populations of indigenous peoples as an important economic resource, and the territory claimed as potentially producing great wealth for individual Spaniards and the crown. Religion played an important role in the Spanish conquest and incorporation of indigenous peoples, bringing them into the Catholic Church peacefully, or by force. The crown created civil and religious structures to administer the vast territory. Spanish men and women settled in great numbers where there were dense indigenous populations and the existence of valuable resources for extraction. The Spanish Empire claimed jurisdiction over the New World in the Caribbean and North and South America, with the exception of Brazil, ceded to Portugal by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Other European powers, including England, France, and the Dutch Republic, took possession of territories initially claimed by Spain. Although the overseas territories under the jurisdiction of the Spanish crown are now commonly called colonies, the term was not used until the second half of 18th century. The process of Spanish settlement, now called colonization, and the colonial era, are terms contested by scholars of Latin America and more generally. It is estimated that during the period 1492–1832, a total of 1.86 million Spaniards settled in the Americas, and a further 3.5 million immigrated during the post-independence era, 1850–1950. The estimate is 250,000 in the 16th century, and most during the 18th century, as immigration was encouraged by the new Bourbon dynasty. The indigenous population plummeted by an estimated 80% in the first century and a half, following Columbus' voyages, primarily through the spread of infectious diseases. Practices of forced labor and slavery for resource extraction and forced resettlement in new villages and later missions were implemented. Alarmed by the precipitous fall in indigenous populations and reports of settlers' exploitation of their labor, the Crown put in place laws to protect their newly converted indigenous vassals. Europeans imported enslaved Africans to the early Caribbean settlements to replace indigenous labor, and enslaved and free Africans were part of colonial-era populations. A mixed-race casta population came into being during the period of Spanish rule. In the early 19th century, the Spanish-American Wars of Independence resulted in the secession of most of Spanish America and the establishment of independent nations. Continuing under Crown rule were Cuba and Puerto Rico, along with the Philippines, which were all lost to the United States in 1898, following the Spanish-American War, ending its rule in the Americas. New Spain. New Spain, officially the Viceroyalty of New Spain, originally the Kingdom of New Spain, was an integral territorial entity of the Spanish Empire, established by Habsburg Spain. It was one of several domains established during the Spanish conquest of the Americas and had its capital in Mexico City. Its jurisdiction comprised a large area of the southern and western portions of North America, mainly what became Mexico and the southwestern United States, but also California, Florida, and Louisiana, Central America as Mexico, the Caribbean like Hispaniola and Martinicans, and northern parts of South America, even Colombia. Several Pacific archipelagos, including the Philippines and Guam. Additional Asian colonies included Spanish Formosa on the island of Taiwan. After the 1521 Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, conqueror Hernán Cortés named the territory New Spain and established the new capital, Mexico City, on the site of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Central Mexico became the base of expeditions of exploration and conquest, expanding the territory claimed by the Spanish Empire. With the political and economic importance of the conquest, the Crown asserted direct control over the densely populated realm. The Crown established New Spain as a viceroyalty in 1535, appointing as viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, an aristocrat loyal to the monarch rather than the conqueror Cortés. New Spain was the first of the viceroyalties that Spain created, the second being Peru in 1542, following the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Both New Spain and Peru had dense indigenous populations at conquest as a source of labor and material wealth in the form of vast silver deposits, discovered and exploited beginning in the mid-1500s. New Spain developed strong regional divisions based on local climate, topography, distance from the capital, and the Gulf Coast port of Veracruz, size, and complexity of indigenous populations, and the presence or absence of mineral resources. Central and southern Mexico had dense indigenous populations, each with complex social, political, and economic organization, but no large-scale deposits of silver to draw Spanish settlers. By contrast, the northern area of Mexico was arid and mountainous, a region of nomadic and semi-nomadic indigenous populations, which do not easily support human settlement. In the 1540s, the discovery of silver in Zacatecas attracted Spanish mining entrepreneurs and workers to exploit the mines, as well as crown officials to ensure the crown received its share of revenue. Silver mining became integral not only to the development of New Spain, but also to the enrichment of the Spanish crown, which marked a transformation in the global economy. New Spain's port of Acapulco became the New World terminus of the trans-Pacific trade with the Philippines via the Manila Galleon. New Spain became a vital link between Spain's New World Empire and its East Indies Empire. From the beginning of the 19th century, the kingdom fell into crisis, aggravated by the 1808 Napoleonic invasion of Iberia and the forced abdication of the Bourbon monarch, Charles IV. This resulted in a political crisis in New Spain and much of the Spanish Empire in 1808, which ended with the government of Viceroy José de Iturrigaray. Conspiracies of American-born Spaniards sought to take power, leading to the Mexican War of Independence, 1810-1821. At its conclusion in 1821, the viceroyalty was dissolved and the Mexican Empire was established. Former royalist military officer turned insurgent for independence, Agustín de Iturbide, would be crowned as emperor. Viceroyalty of Peru. The Viceroyalty of Peru, Spanish Virreinato del Perú, officially known as the Kingdom of Peru, Spanish Reino del Perú, was a Spanish imperial provincial administrative district created in 1542 that originally contained modern-day Peru and most of the Spanish Empire in South America, governed from the capital of Lima. Along with the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Peru was one of two Spanish viceroyalties in the Americas from the 16th to the 18th centuries. The Spanish did not resist the Portuguese expansion of Brazil across the meridian established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The treaty was rendered meaningless between 1580 and 1640, while Spain controlled Portugal. The creation during the 18th century of the viceroyalties of New Granada and Rio de la Plata, at the expense of Peru's territory, reduced the importance of Lima and shifted the lucrative Andean trade to Buenos Aires, while the fall of the mining and textile production accelerated the progressive decay of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Eventually, the Viceroyalty would dissolve, as with much of the Spanish Empire, when challenged by national independence movements at the beginning of the 19th century. These movements led to the formation of the modern-day country of Peru, as well as Chile, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, the territories that at one point or another had constituted the Viceroyalty of Peru, Spanish Main. During the Spanish colonization of the Americas, the Spanish Main was the collective term used by English speakers for the parts of the Spanish Empire that were on the mainland of the Americas and had coastlines on the Caribbean Sea or Gulf of Mexico. The term was used to distinguish those regions from the numerous islands Spain controlled in the Caribbean, which were known as the Spanish West Indies. Spanish West Indies. The Spanish West Indies, Spanish Caribbean, or the Spanish Antilles, also known as Las Antillas Occidentales, or simply Las Antillas Españolas in Spanish, were Spanish territories in the Caribbean. In terms of governance of the Spanish Empire, the Indies was the designation for all its overseas territories and was overseen by the Council of the Indies, founded in 1524 and based in Spain. When the Crown established the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535, the islands of the Caribbean came under its jurisdiction. The islands ruled by Spain were chiefly the Greater Antilles, Hispaniola, including modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. The majority of the Taíno, the indigenous populations on these islands, had died out, or had mixed with the European colonizers by 1520. Spain also claimed the Lesser Antilles, including Martinica, But these smaller islands remained largely independent until they were seized or ceded to other European powers as a result of war or diplomatic agreements during the 17th and 18th centuries. The islands that became the Spanish West Indies were the focus of the voyages of the Spanish expedition of Christopher Columbus to the Americas. Largely due to the familiarity that Spaniards gained from Columbus's voyages, the islands were also the first lands to be permanently colonized by Europeans in the Americas. The Spanish West Indies were also the most enduring part of Spain's American empire, only ending with Cuba and Puerto Rico being surrendered in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War. For over 3 centuries, Spain controlled a network of ports in the Caribbean, including Havana, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Cartagena de Indias, Colombia, Veracruz, Mexico, and Portobelo, Panama, which were connected by galleon routes. Captaincy General of Guatemala. The Captaincy General of Guatemala, Spanish Capitanía General de Guatemala, also known as the Kingdom of Guatemala, Spanish Reino de Guatemala, was an administrative division of the Spanish Empire under the Viceroyalty of New Spain in Central America, including present-day Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the Mexican state of Chiapas. The Governor-Captain-General was also president of the Royal Audiencia of Guatemala, the Superior Court. British America. British America collectively refers to various colonies of Great Britain and its predecessor states in the Americas prior to the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War in 1783. The British monarchy of the Kingdom of England and Kingdom of Scotland, later named the Kingdom of Great Britain of the British Isles and Western Europe, governed many colonies in the Americas beginning in 1585. From 1607, numerous permanent English settlements were made, ultimately reaching from Hudson Bay to the Mississippi River and the Caribbean Sea. Much of these territories were occupied by indigenous peoples, whose populations declined due to epidemics, wars, and massacres. In the Atlantic slave trade, England and other European empires shipped Africans to the Americas for labor in their colonies. Slavery became essential to colonial production, as on Barbados, Jamaica, and other sugar islands. Colonial projects expanded. In 1664, England took the New Netherland colony from the Dutch Republic. In the 1680s, Britain and France began frequent wars over colonies and trade, including their overlapping territorial claims in British America and New France, and relations with the Iroquois. In Queen Anne's War, 1702–1713, the British took Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay area from the French. In the French and Indian War, 1754–1763, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, the British won the eastern half of modern-day Canada and the eastern Mississippi Valley from New France, in the Floridas from New Spain. In the American Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, 13 of these British colonies rebelled against the Crown and formed the United States of America, US, an independent country of 13 states. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, Britain recognized the US as an independent country and ceded to it the British territories directly east of the Mississippi River. The continental territories in North America, which the British retained, are collectively referred to as British North America, but the term was only used after the 1839 Durham Report was published. Saint-Domingue, French pronunciation C'est-Domingue, was a French colony in the western portion of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, in the area of modern-day Haiti, from 1697 to 1803. The name derives from the Spanish main city on the island, Santo Domingo, which came to refer specifically to the Spanish-held Captaincy General of Santo Domingo, now the Dominican Republic. The borders between the two were fluid and changed over time until they were finally solidified in the Dominican War of Independence in 1844. The French had established themselves on the western portion of the islands of Hispaniola and Tortuga by 1659. In the Treaty of Ryswick of 1697, Spain formally recognized French control of Tortuga Island and the western third of the island of Hispaniola. In 1791, slaves and some Creoles took part in a voodoo ceremony at Bois Caiman and planned the Haitian Revolution. The slave rebellion later allied with Republican French forces following the abolition of slavery in the colony in 1793, although this alienated the island's dominant slave-owning class. France controlled the entirety of Hispaniola from 1795 to 1802, when a renewed rebellion began. The last French troops withdrew from the western portion of the island in late 1803, and the colony later declared its independence as Haiti, the Taino name for the island, the following year. Danish West Indies. The Danish West Indies, Danish, Dansk Vestindian, or Danish Virgin Islands, Danish, Danske Jomfruer, or Danish Antilles were a Danish colony in the Caribbean, consisting of the islands of St. Thomas with 83 square kilometers, 32 sqm, St. John, Danish St. Jan with 49 square kilometers, 19 sqm, St. Croix with 220 square kilometers, 85 sqm, and Water Island. The islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix were purchased by the United States in 1917 and became known as the United States Virgin Islands. Water Island was sold in 1905 to the Danish East Asiatic Company and bought by the U.S. government in 1944. In 1996, it also became part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. New Netherland, Dutch New Netherland, was a colony of the Dutch Republic located on the east coast of what is now the United States. The claimed territories extended from the Delmarva Peninsula to Cape Cod. Settlements were established in what became the states of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut, with small outposts in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. The colony was originally conceived by the Dutch West India Company, GWC, in 1621, to capitalize on the North American fur trade. Settlement initially stalled because of policy mismanagement by the GWC and conflicts with Native Americans. The settlement of New Sweden by the Swedish South Company encroached on its southern flank, while its eastern border was redrawn to accommodate the English colonies of an expanding New England Confederation. The colony experienced dramatic growth during the 1650s and became a major center for trade across the North Atlantic. The Dutch conquered New Sweden in 1655, but, during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, surrendered New Netherland to the English following the capture of New Amsterdam. In 1673, the Dutch retook the colony, but relinquished it under the Treaty of Westminster, 1674, that ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The inhabitants of New Netherland, New Netherlanders, were European colonists, Native Americans, and Africans imported as slave laborers. Not including Native Americans, the colonial population, many of whom were not of Dutch descent, was 4,301 in 1650 and 8,000 to 9,000 at the time of transfer to England in 1674. New France was the territory colonized by France in North America, beginning with the exploration of the Gulf of St. Lawrence by Jacques Cartier in 1534, and ending with the cession of New France to Great Britain and Spain in 1763 under the Treaty of Paris. A vast viceroyalty, New France consisted of 5 colonies at its peak in 1712, each with its own administration. Canada, the most developed colony, which was divided into the districts of Quebec, around what is now called Quebec City, Trois-Rivières and Montreal, Hudson Bay, Acadia in the northeast, Terre-Neuve on the island of Newfoundland, and Louisiana. It extended from Newfoundland to the Canadian prairies and from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, including all the Great Lakes of North America. The continent traversing St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers were means of carrying French influence through much of North America. In the 16th century, the lands were used primarily to extract natural resources, such as furs, through trade with the various indigenous peoples. In the 17th century, successful settlements began in Acadia and in Quebec. In the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, France ceded to Great Britain its claims over mainland Acadia, Hudson Bay, and Newfoundland. France established the colony of Ile Royale on Cape Breton Island, where they built the fortress of Louisbourg. The population rose slowly but steadily. In 1754, New France's population consisted of 10,000 Acadians, 55,000 Canadians, and about 4,000 settlers in Upper and Lower Louisiana, 69,000 in total. The British expelled the Acadians in the Great Upheaval from 1755 to 1764, and their descendants are dispersed in the maritime provinces of Canada and in Maine and Louisiana, with small populations in Cheticamp, Nova Scotia, and the Magdalen Islands. Some also went to France. After the 7 Years' War, which included the French and Indian War in America, France ceded the rest of New France to Great Britain and Spain in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, except the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. Britain acquired Canada, Acadia, and French Louisiana east of the Mississippi River, except for the Ile d'Orléans, which was granted to Spain with the territory to the west. In 1800, Spain returned its portion of Louisiana to France under the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, and Napoleon Bonaparte sold it to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, permanently ending French colonial efforts on the American mainland. New France eventually became absorbed within the United States and Canada, with the only vestige of French rule being the tiny islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, an overseas collectivity of France, although Quebec remains predominantly French-speaking. In the United States, the legacy of New France includes numerous place names, as well as small pockets of French-speaking communities. Captaincy General of Venezuela. The Captaincy General of Venezuela, Spanish Capitanía General de Venezuela, was an administrative district of colonial Spain created on September 8, 1777, through the Royal Decree of Graces of 1777, to provide more autonomy for the provinces of Venezuela, previously under the jurisdiction of the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, and thus the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and then the Viceroyalty of New Granada. It established a unified government in political, governorship, military captaincy general, fiscal intendancy, ecclesiastical archdiocese, and judicial audiencia affairs. Its creation was part of the Bourbon reforms and laid the groundwork for the future nation of Venezuela, in particular by orienting the province of Maracaibo towards the province of Caracas. Portuguese colonization of the Americas. Portuguese colonization of the Americas, Portuguese, Colonização Portuguesa da América, constituted territories in the Americas belonging to the Kingdom of Portugal. Portugal was the leading country in the European exploration of the world in the 15th century. The Treaty of Tordesillas, in 1494, divided the earth outside Europe into Castilian and Portuguese global territorial hemispheres for exclusive conquest and colonization. Portugal colonized parts of South America, Brazil, Uruguay, but also made some unsuccessful attempts to colonize North America, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Nova Scotia in Canada. Colonial Brazil. Colonial Brazil, Portuguese, Brazil colonial, sometimes referred to as Portuguese America, comprises the period from 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese, until 1815, when Brazil was elevated to a kingdom in union with Portugal. During the 300 years of Brazilian colonial history, the main economic activities of the territory were based first on Brazil wood extraction, Brazil wood cycle, which gave the territory its name, sugar production, sugar cycle, and finally on gold and diamond mining, gold cycle. Slaves, especially those brought from Africa, provided most of the workforce of the Brazilian export economy, after a brief initial period of indigenous slavery to cut Brazil wood. In contrast to the neighboring Spanish possessions, which had several viceroyalties with jurisdiction initially over New Spain, Mexico, and Peru, and in the 18th century, expanded with the viceroyalties of the Rio de la Plata, Argentina, Uruguay, and Bolivia, and New Granada, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Ecuador, and Guyana. The colony of Brazil was settled mainly in the coastal area by the Portuguese, and a large black slave population working on sugar plantations and mines. The boom and bust of the economic cycles were linked to export products. Brazil's sugar age, with the development of plantation slavery merchants serving as middlemen between production sites, Brazilian ports and Europe, was undermined by the growth of the sugar industry in the Caribbean on islands that European powers seized from Spain. Gold and diamonds were discovered and mined in southern Brazil through the end of the colonial era. Brazilian cities were largely port cities, and the colonial administrative capital was moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro in response to the rise and fall of export products' importance. Unlike Spanish America, which fragmented into many republics upon independence, Brazil remained a single administrative unit under a monarch as the Empire of Brazil, giving rise to the largest country in Latin America. Just as Spanish and Roman Catholicism were a core source of cohesion among Spain's vast and multi-ethnic territories, Brazilian society was united by the Portuguese language and Roman Catholicism. As the only Lusophone polity in the Americas, the Portuguese language was, and remains, particularly important to Brazilian identity. Decolonization. Decolonization of the Americas. The decolonization of the Americas occurred over several centuries, as most of the countries in the Americas gained their independence from European rule. The American Revolution was the first in the Americas, and the British defeat in the American Revolutionary War, 1775–83, was a victory against a great power, aided by France and Spain, Britain's enemies. The French Revolution in Europe followed, and collectively these events had profound effects on the Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies in the Americas. A revolutionary wave followed, resulting in the creation of several independent countries in Latin America. The Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804, perhaps one of the most successful slave uprisings in history, resulted in the independence of the French slave colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. The Peninsular War with France, which resulted from the Napoleonic occupation of Spain, caused Spanish Creoles in Spanish America to question their allegiance to Spain, stoking independence movements that culminated in various Spanish-American wars of independence, 1808–33, which were primarily fought between opposing groups of colonists and only secondarily against Spanish forces. At the same time, the Portuguese monarchy fled to Brazil during the French invasion of Portugal. After the royal court returned to Lisbon, the Prince Regent, Pedro, remained in Brazil and in 1822 successfully declared himself emperor of a newly independent Brazilian empire. Spain would lose all three of its remaining Caribbean colonies by the end of the 1800s. Santo Domingo declared its first independence from Spain in 1821. The independent state was renamed Republic of Spanish Haiti. Haiti conquered the region shortly afterwards in 1822. 2 decades later, in 1844, independence was proclaimed for the second time, and the Dominican Republic was established. This triggered the Dominican War of Independence, 1844–56. In 1861, however, Spain regained control of the territory, and the colony was re-established. The Dominican Restoration War, 1863–65, the Second War of Liberation, led to the second independence from Spain and the Dominican Republic's third and final independence. Cuba fought for independence from Spain in the 10 Years' War, 1868–78, and Little War, 1879–80, and finally the Cuban War of Independence, 1895–98. American intervention in 1898 became the Spanish-American War and resulted in the United States gaining Puerto Rico, Guam, which are still U.S. territories, and the Philippine Islands in the Pacific Ocean. Under military occupation, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate until its independence in 1902. Peaceful independence by the voluntary withdrawal of colonial powers then became the norm in the second half of the 20th century. However, there are still British and Dutch colonies in North America, mostly Caribbean islands. France has fully integrated most of its former colonies in the Americas, French Guiana, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, as fully constituent departments of France. The formation of sovereign states in the New World began with the United States Declaration of Independence of 1776. The American Revolutionary War lasted through the period of the Siege of Yorktown, its last major campaign, in the early autumn of 1781, with peace being achieved in 1783. In 1804, after the French of Napoleon Bonaparte were defeated during the Haitian Revolution under the black leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, declare the colony of Saint-Domingue independence of the Haitian Declaration of Independence, as he renamed the country Haiti, meaning Land of Mountains. Haiti became the world's first black-led republic in the New World, the first Caribbean state, as well as the first Latin American country and the second oldest independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, to win independence from Britain in 1783. The Spanish colonies won their independence in the first quarter of the 19th century in the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, among others, led their independence struggle. Although Bolívar attempted to keep the Spanish-speaking parts of Latin America politically allied, they rapidly became independent of one another as well, and several further wars were fought, such as the Paraguayan War and the War of the Pacific. In the Portuguese colony, Dom Pedro I, also Pedro IV of Portugal, son of the Portuguese king Dom João VI, proclaimed the country's independence in 1822 and became Brazil's first emperor. This was peacefully accepted by the crown in Portugal upon compensation. Effects of slavery. Slavery has had a significant role in the economic development of the New World after the colonization of the Americas by the Europeans. The cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane harvested by slaves became important exports for the United States and the Caribbean countries. 20th century, North America, history of North America. The history of North America encompasses the past developments of people populating the continent of North America. While it was commonly accepted that the continent first became inhabited by humans when individuals migrated across the Bering Sea, 40,000 to 17,000 years ago, more recent discoveries may have pushed those estimates back at least another 90,000 years. People settled throughout the continent and, over time, developed into diverse communities, from the Inuit in the far north to the Mayans and Aztecs in the south. These complex communities each developed their own unique cultures and ways of life. Records of European travel to North America begin with the Norse colonization in the 10th century AD. In 985, they founded a settlement on Greenland that persisted until the early 1400s. They also explored the east coast of Canada, but their settlements there were much smaller and shorter-lived. With the age of exploration and the voyages of Christopher Columbus, starting in 1492, Europeans began to arrive in the Americas in large numbers and develop colonial ambitions for both North and South America. An influx of Europeans soon followed Columbus and overwhelmed native populations, as North America became a staging ground for ongoing European rivalries. The continent was divided by three prominent European powers: England, France, and Spain. The influence of colonization by these states on North American cultures is still apparent today. Conflict over resources in North America ensued in various wars between these powers, but the new European colonies gradually developed desires for independence. Revolutions, such as the American Revolution and the Mexican War of Independence, created new independent states that came to dominate North America. The Canadian Confederation formed in 1867, marking the beginning of the modern political landscape of North America. North American states have, since the 19th century, developed increasingly deep connections with each other. Although some conflicts have occurred, the continent has enjoyed general peace and cooperation, as well as open commerce and trade between its states. Modern developments include the opening of free trade agreements in 1994 and heightened emigration rates and drug trafficking concerns in Mexico and Latin America. As a part of the British Empire, Canada immediately entered World War I when it broke out in 1914. Canada bore the brunt of several major battles during the early stages of the war, including the use of poison gas attacks at Ypres. Losses became grave, and the government eventually brought in conscription, despite the fact this was against the wishes of the majority of French Canadians. In the ensuing conscription crisis of 1917, riots broke out on the streets of Montreal. In neighboring Newfoundland, the new Dominion suffered a devastating loss on 1st of July 1916, the first day on the Somme. The United States stayed out of the conflict until 1917, when it joined the Entente powers. The United States was then able to play a crucial role at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 that shaped interwar Europe. Mexico was not part of the war, as the country was embroiled in the Mexican Revolution at the time. Further information: Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, and Cristero War. The 1920s brought an age of great prosperity in the United States, and to a lesser degree Canada. But the Wall Street crash of 1929, combined with drought, ushered in a period of economic hardship in the United States and Canada. From 1926 to 1929, there was a popular uprising against the anti-Catholic Mexican government of the time, set off specifically by the anti-clerical provisions of the Mexican Constitution of 1917. Once again, Canada found itself at war before its neighbors, with numerically modest but significant contributions overseas, such as the Battle of Hong Kong and the Battle of Britain. The entry of the United States into the war helped to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. Two Mexican tankers, transporting oil to the United States, were attacked and sunk by the Germans in the Gulf of Mexico waters in 1942. The incident happened in spite of Mexico's neutrality at that time. This led Mexico to enter the conflict with a declaration of war on the Axis nations. The destruction of Europe, wrought by the war, vaulted all North American countries to more important roles in world affairs, especially the United States, which emerged as a superpower. The early Cold War era saw the United States as the most powerful nation in a Western coalition, of which Mexico and Canada were also a part. In Canada, Quebec was transformed by the Quiet Revolution and the emergence of Quebec nationalism. Mexico experienced an era of huge economic growth after World War II, a heavy industrialization process and a growth of its middle class, a period known in Mexican history as El Milagro Mexicano, the Mexican miracle. The Caribbean saw the beginnings of decolonization, while on the largest island, the Cuban Revolution introduced Cold War rivalries into Latin America. The civil rights movement in the U.S. ended Jim Crow and empowered black voters in the 1960s, which allowed black citizens to move into high government offices for the first time since Reconstruction. However, the dominant New Deal coalition collapsed in the mid-1960s in disputes over race and the Vietnam War, and the conservative movement began its rise to power as the once dominant liberalism weakened and collapsed. Canada during this era was dominated by the leadership of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. In 1982, at the end of his tenure, Canada enshrined a new constitution. Canada's Brian Mulroney not only ran on a similar platform, but also favored closer trade ties with the United States. This led to the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in January 1989. Mexican presidents Miguel de la Madrid in the early 1980s and Carlos Salinas de Gortari in the late 1980s started implementing liberal economic strategies that were seen as a good move. However, Mexico experienced a strong economic recession in 1982, and the Mexican peso suffered a devaluation. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan attempted to move the United States back towards a hard anti-communist line in foreign affairs, in what his supporters saw as an attempt to assert moral leadership in the world community. Domestically, Reagan attempted to bring in a package of privatization and regulation to stimulate the economy. The end of the Cold War and the beginning of the era of sustained economic expansion coincided during the 1990s. On January 1994, Canada, Mexico, and the United States signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, creating the world's largest free trade area. In 2000, Vicente Fox became the first non-PRI candidate to win the Mexican presidency in over 70 years. The optimism of the 1990s was shattered by the 9/11 attacks of 2001 on the United States, which prompted military intervention in Afghanistan, which also involved Canada. Canada did not support the United States' later move to invade Iraq, however. In the US, the Reagan era of conservative national policies, deregulation, and tax cuts took control with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. By 2010, political scientists were debating whether the election of Barack Obama in 2008 represented an end of the Reagan era, or was only a reaction against the bubble economy of the 2000s decade, which burst in 2008 and became the late 2000s recession with prolonged unemployment. Central America. History of Central America. 20th century political map of Central America. Central America is commonly said to include Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. This definition matches modern political borders. Central America begins geographically in Mexico, at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Mexico's narrowest point. In the former country of Yucatan, 1841-1848, was part of Central America. At the other end, before its independence in 1903, Panama was part of South America, as it was a department of Colombia. At times, Belize, a British colony until 1981, where English instead of Spanish is spoken, and where the population is primarily of African origin, has been considered not part of Spanish-speaking Central America. Political evolution of Central America and the Caribbean from 1700 to present. Long and narrow, Central America does not have an obvious geographical center. Until the middle of the 20th century, there were no roads between the countries, which isolated them from each other, and railroads have never connected them. During colonial times, Guatemala was the administrative and religious center. Religiously, it remains so. However, attempts to create a Central American political union, like the European Union, have failed. The countries that joined the EU already had extensive cross-border traffic by train. Even today, 2021, there is by comparison very little and none by train. The countries, furthermore, are more diverse than they appear at first glance. Some, Guatemala, have a large indigenous or Native American population. Others, Costa Rica, do not. Some, El Salvador, are focused on their Pacific coast, while in others, Belize, Honduras, the Caribbean or Atlantic coast is more important. Panama, and to a lesser extent, Guatemala and Costa Rica have both coasts playing a significant role. Some countries have stable governments, Costa Rica, others do not. Nicaragua, El Salvador. Panama is heavily Americanized, uses the US dollar as its currency, has a large industry and source of revenue, the canal, and a sophistication which comes from the ships and people passing through the country, and previously the US military installations in the former canal zone. Central America. Central America is a sub-region of North America. Its political boundaries are defined as bordering Mexico to the north, Colombia to the southeast, the Caribbean to the east, and the Pacific Ocean to the southwest. Central America is usually defined as consisting of 7 countries: Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. Within Central America is the Mesoamerican biodiversity hotspot, which extends from southern Mexico to southeastern Panama. Due to the presence of several active geologic faults and the Central American volcanic arc, there is a high amount of seismic activity in the region, such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, which has resulted in death, injury, and property damage. Most of Central America falls under the Istmo-Colombian cultural area. Before the Spanish expedition of Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas, hundreds of indigenous peoples made their homes in the area. From the year 1502 onwards, Spain began their colonization. From 1609 to 1821, the majority of Central American territories, except for what would become Belize and Panama and including the modern Mexican state of Chiapas, were governed by the Viceroyalty of New Spain from Mexico City as the Captaincy General of Guatemala. On 24 August 1821, Spanish Viceroy Juan de O'Donoghue signed the Treaty of Córdoba, which established New Spain's independence and autonomy from mainland Spain. On 15th September, the Act of Independence of Central America was enacted to announce Central America is separation from the Spanish Empire. Some of New Spain's provinces in the Central American region were invaded and annexed to the First Mexican Empire. However, in 1823 they seceded from Mexico to form the Federal Republic of Central America until 1838. In 1838, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua became the first of Central America's 7 states to become independent countries, followed by El Salvador in 1841, Panama in 1903, and Belize in 1981. Despite the dissolution of the Federal Republic of Central America, the 5 remaining countries, save for Panama and Belize, all preserved and maintained a Central American identity. The Spanish-speaking countries officially include both North America and South America as a single continent. America, which is split into 4 subregions: Central America, Insular America, aka the West Indies, North America, Mexico, and Northern America, and South America. Despite the failure of a lasting political union, the concept of Central American reunification, though lacking enthusiasm from the leaders of the individual countries, rises from time to time. In 1856, 1857, The region successfully established a military coalition to repel an invasion by United States adventurer William Walker. Today, all 5 nations fly flags that retain the old federal motif of 2 outer blue bands bounding an inner white stripe. Costa Rica, traditionally the least committed of the 5 to regional integration, modified its flag significantly in 1848 by darkening the blue and adding a double-wide inner red band in honor of the French tricolor. In 1907, a Central American Court of Justice was created. On 13th December 1960, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua established the Central American Common Market, CACMA. Costa Rica, because of its relative economic prosperity and political stability, chose not to participate in the CACM. The goals for the CACM were to create greater political unification and success of import substitution industrialization policies. The project was an immediate economic success, but was abandoned after the 1969 football war between El Salvador and Honduras. A Central American Parliament has operated as a purely advisory body since 1991. Costa Rica has repeatedly declined invitations to join the regional parliament, which seats deputies from the 4 other former members of the Union, as well as from Panama and the Dominican Republic. South America. History of South America. The history of South America is the study of the past, particularly the written record. Oral histories and traditions passed down from generation to generation on the continent of South America. The continent continues to be home to indigenous peoples, some of whom built high civilizations prior to the arrival of Europeans in the late 1400s and early 1500s. South America has a history that has a wide range of human cultures and forms of civilization. The Norte Chico civilization in Peru, dating back to about 3500 BCE, is the oldest civilization in the Americas, and one of the first 6 independent civilizations in the world. It was contemporaneous with the Egyptian pyramids. It predated the Mesoamerican Olmec by nearly 2 millennia. Indigenous peoples, thousands of years of independent life, were disrupted by European colonization from Spain and Portugal, and by demographic collapse. The resulting civilizations, however, were very different from those of their colonizers, both in the mestizos and the indigenous cultures of the continent. Through the transatlantic slave trade, South America, especially Brazil, became the home of millions of people of the African diaspora. The mixing of ethnic groups led to new social structures. The tensions between Europeans, indigenous peoples, and African slaves and their descendants shaped South America as a whole, starting in the 16th century. Most of Spanish America achieved its independence in the early 19th century through hard-fought wars, while Portuguese Brazil first became the seat of the Portuguese Empire and then an empire independent of Portugal. With the revolution for independence from the Spanish crown achieved during the 19th century, South America underwent yet more social and political changes. These have included nation-building projects, absorbing waves of immigration from Europe in the late 19th and 20th centuries, dealing with increased international trade, colonization of hinterlands, and wars about territory ownership and power balance. During this period, there has also been the reorganization of indigenous rights and duties, subjugation of indigenous peoples living in the state's frontiers that lasted until the early 1900s, liberal-conservative conflicts among the ruling classes, and major demographic and environmental changes accompanying the development of sensitive habitats. In the 1960s and 1970s, the governments of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay were overthrown or displaced by the UFAS-aligned military dictatorships. These dictatorships detained tens of thousands of political prisoners, many of whom were tortured and/or killed. Economically, they began a transition to neoliberal economic policies. They placed their own actions within the United States Cold War doctrine of national security against internal subversion. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Peru suffered from an internal conflict. Revolutionary movements and right-wing military dictatorships have been common. But starting in the 1980s, a wave of democratization came through the continent, and democratic rule is widespread now. Allegations of corruption remain common, and several nations have seen crises which have forced the resignation of their presidents, although normal civilian succession has continued. International indebtedness became a notable problem, as most recently illustrated by Argentina's default in the early 21st century. In recent years, South American governments have drifted to the left, with socialist leaders being elected in Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, and a leftist president in Argentina and Uruguay. Despite the move to the left, South America is still largely capitalist. With the founding of the Union of South American Nations, South America has started down the road of economic integration, with plans for political integration in the European Union style. Caribbean.
The history of the Caribbean is a history of struggle between the great colonial powers of Europe since the 15th century. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he claimed the islands for Spain and the following year established the first Spanish settlements there. Although the Spanish conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires in the early 16th century made Mexico and Peru more attractive to the Spanish for exploration and settlement, the Caribbean remained strategically important. From the 1620s and 1630s onwards, non-Hispanic providers, traders, and settlers established permanent colonies and trading posts on the islands. By the end of the 17th century, these colonies spread throughout the Caribbean from the Bahamas in the northwest to Tobago in the southeast. During this time, French, Dutch, and English buccaneers also settled in the Caribbean, mainly on the island of Tortuga. The northern and western coasts of Hispaniola, which today is Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and later in Jamaica, and the island of Martinique. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico were no longer part of the Spanish Empire in the New World. The Caribbean was again important in the 20th century. During World War II, the decolonization wave after the war, and in the tension between communist Cuba and the United States, forced migration of enslaved Africans, immigration of Europeans, Chinese, South Asians, and others. And rivalry amongst world powers since the 16th century have given Caribbean history an impact disproportionate to its size. Many islands have attained independence from colonial powers and sovereignty. Others have formal political ties with major powers, including the United States. The early economic structure integrating the Caribbean into the Atlantic world and world economic system continues to impact the modern Caribbean region. Throughout the 20th century, several island countries, such as Jamaica and Barbados, gained independence from British rule. As a result, many of the English-speaking states and territories shifted their economies to tourism and offshore bank industries. During the Cold War, the Caribbean has faced a series of military interventions from the United States, such as the Banana Wars and the Cuban Missile Crisis. History of Latin America-United States relations. Bilateral relations between the various countries of Latin America and the United States of America have been multifaceted and complex, at times defined by strong regional cooperation, and at others filled with economic and political tension and rivalry. Although relations between the U.S. government and most of Latin America were limited prior to the late 1800s, for most of the past century, the United States has unofficially regarded parts of Latin America as within its sphere of influence, and for much of the Cold War, vied with the Soviet Union. The political context evolved again in the 2000s, with the election in several South American countries of socialist governments. This pink tide thus saw the successive elections of Hugo in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Kirchner in Argentina, in Uruguay, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Fernando Lugo in Paraguay, Mujica in Uruguay, Ollanta Humala in Peru, Luis Guillermo in Costa Rica, Salvador in El Salvador, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. Although these leaders vary in their policies and attitude towards both Washington, D.C., and neoliberalism, while the states they govern also have different agendas and long-term historic tendencies, which can lead to rivalry and open contempt between themselves. They seem to have agreed on refusing the ALCA, and on following a regional integration without the United States overseeing the process. In particular, while Kirchner and Lula, who has been criticized by the left wing in Brazil, including by the Movimento dos Sem Terra landless peasants movement, are seen as more centered. The state of Bolivia also has seen some friction with Brazil, as well as Chile. Muriel Rubini, professor of economics at New York University, said in a May 2006 interview, On one hand, you have a number of administrations that are committed to moderate economic reform. On the other hand, you've had something of a backlash against the Washington Consensus, a set of liberal economic policies that Washington-based institutions urged Latin American countries to follow, including privatization, trade, liberalization, and fiscal discipline, and some emergence of populist leaders. In the same way, although a leader such as verbally attacked the George W. Bush administration as much as the latter attacked him, and claimed to be following a democratic socialist Bolivarian revolution. The geopolitical context has changed a lot since the 1970s. Larry Burns, director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, thus stated, "For influence in the Western Hemisphere, today, the ties between the United States and most of Latin America are generally cordial, but there remain areas of tension between the two sides. Latin America is the largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States and its fastest growing trading partner, as well as the largest source of illegal drugs and immigration, both documented and otherwise, all of which underline the continually evolving relationship between the region and country." The relationship between Latin America and the United States has been marked by periods of tension and cordiality. History of the West Coast of North America. The human history of the west coast of North America is believed to stretch back to the arrival of the earliest people over the Bering Strait, or alternately along the ice-free coastal islands of British Columbia. This was followed by the development of significant pre-Columbian cultures and population densities, and later arrival of the European explorers and colonization of the coast. The west coast of North America today is home to some of the largest and most important companies in the world, as well as being a center of world culture. History of Latin America. The term Latin America originated in the 1830s, primarily through Michel Chevalier, who proposed the region could ally with Latin Europe against other European cultures. It primarily refers to the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries in the New World. Before the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the region was home to many indigenous peoples, including advanced civilizations, most notably from the south: the Olmec, Maya, Muisca, Aztecs, and Inca. The region came under control of the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, which established colonies and imposed Roman Catholicism and their languages. Both brought African slaves to their colonies as laborers, exploiting large settled societies and their resources. The Spanish crown regulated immigration, allowing only Christians to travel to the New World. The colonization process led to significant native population declines due to disease, forced labor, and violence. They imposed their culture, destroying native codices and artwork. Colonial-era religion played a crucial role in everyday life, with the Spanish crown ensuring religious purity and aggressively prosecuting perceived deviations like witchcraft. In the early 19th century, nearly all areas of Spanish America attained independence by armed struggle, with the exceptions of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Brazil, which had become a monarchy separate from Portugal, became a republic in the late 19th century. Political independence from European monarchies did not result in the abolition of black slavery in the new nations. It resulted in political and economic instability in Spanish America. Immediately after independence, Great Britain and the United States exercised significant influence in the post-independence era, resulting in a form of neocolonialism where political sovereignty remained in place. But foreign powers exercised considerable power in the economic sphere. Newly independent nations faced domestic and interstate conflicts, struggling with economic instability and social inequality. The 20th century brought U.S. intervention and the Cold War's impact on the region, with revolutions in countries like Cuba influencing Latin American politics. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw shifts towards left-wing governments, followed by conservative resurgences and a recent resurgence of left-wing politics in several countries. History of the Southern United States. The history of the Southern United States spans back thousands of years to the first evidence of human occupation. The Paleo-Indians were the first peoples to inhabit the Americas and what would become the Southern United States. By the time Europeans arrived in the 15th century, the region was inhabited by the Mississippian people. European history in the region would begin with the earliest days of the exploration. Spain, France, and especially England explored and claimed parts of the region. Starting in the 17th century, the history of the Southern United States developed unique characteristics that came from its economy-based primarily on plantation agriculture and the ubiquitous and prevalent institution of slavery. While West Africans were brought to the region as soon as English colonization began, the system was strictly formalized after Bacon's Rebellion. Afterwards, millions of enslaved Africans, approximately 10% of all slaves taken from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, were imported to the United States, primarily, but not exclusively, for forced labor in the South. While the great majority of whites did not own slaves, slavery was nevertheless the foundation of the region's economy and social order. Southern slavery denied basic human rights to Black Americans and permeated all parts of daily life of all residents. Questions of Southern slavery directly impacted the struggle for American independence throughout the South and gave the region additional power in Congress. Almost all Southern founding fathers owned slaves, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Though Washington did free all enslaved persons in his will, as industrial technologies, including the cotton gin, made slavery even more profitable, Southern states refused to ban slavery, perpetuating the division of the United States between free and slave states. Tensions escalated as the United States expanded westward, also retroactively, causing the Southeast region to also expand to the west. However, tepid agreements, including the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, did not resolve the growing divisions the South had with the North due to slavery and the planter class's political aspirations to control the entire country. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 caused South Carolina to secede, which was soon followed by all other states in the region, with the exception of the border states. The breakaway states formed the Confederate States of America, the most significant country in modern history worldwide, that was founded for the purpose of promoting slavery. Lincoln's original goal was only to preserve the United States, but to do that he had to destroy the Confederacy's economic base, slavery. Therefore, his Emancipation Proclamation brought freedom to Black slaves living in rebellious areas as soon as the U.S. Army arrived. With a smaller economy, smaller population, and widespread dissent among its white population, the Confederate States of America was unable to carry on a protracted struggle with the national government. The 13th and 14th Amendments gave freedom, citizenship, and civil rights to Black Americans all across the United States. The 15th Amendment and radical Reconstruction laws gave Black men the vote. And for a few years they shared power in the South, despite violent attacks by the Ku Klux Klan. Reconstruction attempted to uplift the formerly enslaved, but this crusade was abandoned in the Compromise of 1877, and conservative white Southerners, calling themselves Redeemers, took control. Even though the Ku Klux Klan was suppressed, new white supremacist organizations, including the Red Shirts and the White League, continued to terrorize Black Americans. After the dissolution of a populist movement in the 1890s that attempted to unite working-class blacks and whites, segregation and Jim Crow laws were implemented all across the region. By 1900, compared to the North, the Southern United States lost its previous political and economic power and fell behind the rest of the United States for decades. Its agricultural economy was often based on sharecropping practices. The New Deal and World War II brought about a generation of liberal Southerners within the Democratic Party that looked to accelerate development. The white South had a strong voice in Congress, which reorganized the cotton and tobacco markets to the advantage of Southern farmers. The government top-rated Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and modernization to that state. Yet, in exchange for economic reforms, the Progressive New Deal coalition carried an uneasy compromise with segregationist Democrats that the Jim Crow system would be left unaltered and the denial of basic civil rights to Black Americans would continue. Years after President Franklin D. Roosevelt died, his Supreme Court appointees started dismantling segregation in the 1950s. Black Americans and their allies resisted Jim Crow and segregation. Initially, with the Great Migration and later the Civil Rights Movement, in the face of intense opposition by racist segregationists, Black Southerners, including Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others in a multiracial coalition, vigorously campaigned to end institutionalized racism in the American South, as well as the rest of the United States. From a political and legal standpoint, many of these aims were realized by the Supreme Court's ruling on Brown v. Board and President Lyndon Johnson's reforms. Civil rights coupled with the collapse of Black Belt agriculture has led some historians to postulate that a new South based on free trade, globalization, and cultural diversity has emerged. Meanwhile, the the South has influenced the rest of the United States in a process called Southernization. The legacy of slavery and Jim Crow continue to impact the region, which by the 21st century was the most populous area of the United States. American frontier. The American frontier, also known as the Old West and popularly known as the Wild West, encompasses the geography, history, folklore, and culture associated with the forward wave of American expansion in mainland North America that began with European colonial settlements in the early 17th century and ended with the admission of the last few contiguous Western territories as states in 1912. This era of massive migration and settlement was particularly encouraged by President Thomas Jefferson following the Louisiana Purchase, giving rise to the expansionist attitude known as Manifest Destiny and historians' frontier thesis. The legends, historical events, and folklore of the American frontier, known as the frontier myth, have embedded themselves into United States culture. So much so that the Old West, and the Western genre of media specifically, has become one of the defining features of American national identity. History of New England. New England is the oldest clearly defined region of the United States, being settled more than 150 years before the American Revolution. The first colony in New England was Plymouth Colony, established in 1620 by the Puritan Pilgrims who were fleeing religious persecution in England. A large influx of Puritans populated the New England region during the Puritan migration to New England. 1622-1640, largely in the Boston and Salem area, farming, fishing, and lumbering prospered, as did whaling and sea trading. New England writers and events in the region helped launch the American War of Independence, which began when fighting erupted between British troops and Massachusetts militia in the battles of Lexington and Concord. The region later became a stronghold of the Federalist Party. By the 1840s, New England was the center of the American anti-slavery movement and was the leading force in American literature and higher education. It was at the center of the Industrial Revolution in America, with many textile mills and machine shops operating. By 1830, the region was the manufacturing center of the entire United States for much of the 19th century, and it played an important role during the American Civil War as an intellectual, political, and cultural promoter of abolitionism and civil rights. Manufacturing in the United States began to shift south and west during the 20th century, and New England experienced a sustained period of economic decline. By the beginning of the 21st century, however, the region had become a center for technology, weapons, manufacturing, scientific research, and financial services. List of conflicts in the Americas. This is a list of conflicts in the Americas. This list includes all present-day countries, starting northward first from Northern America, Canada, Greenland, and the United States of America, southward to Middle America, Aridoamerica, Asia, and Mesoamerica in Mexico, and Central America over Panama, Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, eastward to the Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Martin, the Dominican Republic, and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and South America. In Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Conflicts are also arranged chronologically, starting from the pre-Columbian era, the Lithic, Archaic, Formative, Classic, Post-Classic, and Colonial periods, stages of North America and Mesoamerica. C. 18,000 BCE, c. 1821 CE, up to the post-colonial period. C. 1821 CE present. This list includes any raid, strike, skirmish, siege, sacking, and/or battleland, naval, and air, that occurred on the territories of what may today be referred to as falling within any of the aforementioned modern nations, however, in which the conflict itself may have only been part of an operation of a campaign in a theater of a greater war. For example, any and/or all border, undeclared, colonial proxy, liberation, global, Indian wars, etc. There may also be periods of violent civil unrest listed, such as shootouts, spree killings, massacres, terrorist attacks, coups, assassinations, regicides, riots, rebellions, revolutions, and civil wars, as well as wars of succession and/or independence. The list might also contain episodes of human sacrifice, mass suicide, and ethnic cleansing. Genocide. Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire, sometimes referred to as the Hispanic monarchy or the Catholic monarchy, was a colonial empire that existed between 1492 and 1976. In conjunction with the Portuguese Empire, it ushered in the European Age of Discovery. It achieved a global scale, controlling vast portions of the Americas, Africa, various islands in Asia and Oceania, as well as territory in other parts of Europe. It was one of the most powerful empires of the early modern period, becoming known as the empire on which the sun never sets. At its greatest extent in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Spanish Empire covered 13.7 million square kilometers, 5.3 million square miles, making it one of the largest empires in history. Beginning with the 1492 arrival of Christopher Columbus and continuing for over 3 centuries, the Spanish Empire would expand across the Caribbean islands, half of South America, most of Central America, and much of North America. The Magellan Elcano circumnavigation, the first circumnavigation of the Earth, laid the foundation for Spain's Pacific Empire and for Spanish control over the East Indies. The influx of gold and silver from the mines in Zacatecas and Guanajuato in Mexico, and in Boliv, enriched the Spanish crown and financed military endeavors and territorial expansion. Another crucial element of the empire's expansion was the financial support provided by Genoese bankers, who financed royal expeditions and military campaigns. In 1700, Philip V became King of Spain after the death of Charles II, the last Habsburg monarchy of Spain, who died without an heir. His ascension triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, as various European powers contested his claim to the throne. The conflict concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, allowing Philip, the first Bourbon King of Spain, to retain the throne, but resulting in territorial losses for Spain: Gibraltar, Minorca, the Spanish Netherlands, and Spanish Italy. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, Spain ceded both East Florida and West Florida to Great Britain, while gaining Louisiana from France. However, in 1783, following the American Revolutionary War, Britain ceded both Floridas back to Spain as part of the Treaty of Paris. Spain had recaptured West Florida in 1781 through military operations. Both Floridas were ceded to the United States in 1819 as part of the Adams Treaty. Louisiana was ceded back to France in 1801 in the Treaty of Orange. The Bourbon monarchy implemented reforms like the Nueva Planta decrees, which centralized power and abolished regional privileges. Economic policies promoted trade with the colonies, enhancing Spanish influence in the Americas. Socially, tensions emerged between the ruling elite and the rising bourgeoisie, as well as divisions between peninsular Spaniards and Creoles in the Americas. These factors ultimately set the stage for the independence movements that began in the early 19th century, leading to the gradual disintegration of Spanish colonial authority. By the mid-1820s, Spain had lost its territories in Mexico, Central America, and South America. By 1900, it had also lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, and Guam in the Mariana Islands following the Spanish-American War. Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese Empire A was a colonial empire that existed between 1415 and 1999. In conjunction with the Spanish Empire, it ushered in the European Age of Discovery. It achieved a global scale, controlling vast portions of the Americas, Africa, and various islands in Asia and Oceania. It was one of the most powerful empires of the early modern period. While at its greatest extent in 1820, covering 5.5 million square km, 2.1 million square miles, making it among the largest empires in history, composed of the overseas colonies, factories, and later overseas territories, governed by the Kingdom of Portugal and later the Republic of Portugal. It was the longest-lived colonial empire in European history, lasting 584 years from the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415 to the transfer of sovereignty over Macau to China in 1999. The power and influence of the Kingdom of Portugal would eventually expand across the globe. In the wake of the Reconquista, Portuguese sailors began exploring the coast of Africa and the Atlantic archipelagos in 1418 to 1419. Using recent developments in navigation, cartography, and maritime technology such as the caravel, with the aim of finding a sea route to the source of the lucrative spice trade. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, And in 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. In 1500, either by an accidental landfall or by the crown's secret design. Pedro Álvares Cabral reached what would be Brazil. Over the following decades, Portuguese sailors continued to explore the coasts and islands of East Asia, establishing forts and factories as they went. By 1571, a string of naval outposts connected Lisbon to Nagasaki along the coasts of Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. This commercial network and the colonial trade had a substantial positive impact on Portuguese economic growth. 1500-800, when it accounted for about a fifth of Portugal's per capita income. When King Philip II of Spain, Philip I of Portugal, seized the Portuguese crown in 1580. There began a 60-year union between Spain and Portugal, known to subsequent historiography as the Iberian Union. Although the realms continued to have separate administrations, as the King of Spain was also King of Portugal. Portuguese colonies became the subject of attacks by three rival European powers hostile to Spain: the Dutch Republic, England, and France. With its smaller population, Portugal found itself unable to effectively defend its overstretched network of trading posts, and the empire began a long and gradual decline. Eventually, Brazil became the most valuable colony of the Second Era of Empire, 1663 to 1825. Until, as part of the wave of independence movements that swept the Americas during the early 19th century, it broke away in 1822. The Third Era of Empire covers the final stage of Portuguese colonialism after the independence of Brazil in the 1820s. By then, the colonial possessions had been reduced to forts and plantations along the African coastline. Expanded inland during the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, Portuguese Timor, and enclaves in India, Portuguese India and China, Portuguese Macau. The 1890 British ultimatum led to the contraction of Portuguese ambitions in Africa. Under Salazar in office, 1932 to 1968, the Estado Novo dictatorship made some ill-fated attempts to cling on to its last remaining colonies. Under the ideology of plural continentalism, the regime renamed its colonies overseas provinces, while retaining the system of forced labor, from which only a small indigenous was normally exempt. In August 1961, the Dahomean annexed the fort of São Baptista de, and in December that year, India annexed Goa, Daman, and Dio. The Portuguese colonial war in Africa lasted from 1961 until the final overthrow of the Estado Novo regime in 1974. The Carnation Revolution of April 1974 in Lisbon led to the hasty decolonization of Portuguese Africa and to the 1975 annexation of Portuguese Timor by Indonesia. Decolonization prompted the exodus of nearly all the Portuguese colonial settlers and of many mixed-race people from the colonies. Portugal returned Macau to China in 1999, the only overseas possessions to remain under Portuguese rule. The Azores and Madeira both had overwhelmingly Portuguese populations, and Lisbon subsequently changed their constitutional status from overseas provinces to autonomous regions. The Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries, CPLP, is the cultural successor of the empire, analogous to the Commonwealth of Nations, for countries formerly part of the British Empire. The history of the Americas isn't just a timeline, it's a buried treasure chest of stories that were silenced, civilizations that were forgotten, and truths that were never meant to be found. And what we covered today, that's just the tip of the pyramid. There are still questions no one's dared to answer. Who were the real first visitors to the Americas? What ancient technology did they use? And what else is still hidden beneath the rainforest, the deserts, and our modern cities? If you're as curious as I am, then hit that subscribe button, because we've only just started digging. Drop a comment below with the secret you want uncovered next. And if you think history should include the voices they try to erase, give this video a like. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what survived. Subscribe, watch the next mystery, join the conversation below. The Untold History of the Americas. What they don't want you to know. What you've just seen isn't fiction, it's the forgotten truth. The Americas were not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were alive, thriving with science, art, architecture, philosophy, diplomacy, and empires that ruled millions. But their stories were buried, burned, rewritten. For centuries, we were told these people had no history, that they vanished, that they were discovered. But the ruins tell a different story. And now, the silence is finally breaking. From the towering cities beneath the Amazon canopy, to the mathematical genius of the Maya, to the political resistance of indigenous nations that defied entire empires. This is the version of history that was hidden until now. So, here's the question. If this much has been left out, what else don't we know? Was there transoceanic contact before Columbus? Are there still ancient cities undiscovered under the jungle and sand? And why are these revelations only just coming to light now? This journey is far from over. Every ancient clue we uncover opens a dozen new mysteries. So if you're ready to keep digging, subscribe, hit the bell, and join this growing community of curious minds. Comment below with the story you want us to uncover next. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to remember. Next up, watch The Lost Cities Beneath the Amazon. Subscribe for weekly discoveries. Your voice matters. Tell us what the textbooks missed.